In the 1920s, the Japanese Navy found itself with something of an issue. The Washington Naval Treaty had constrained their available tonnage. When it came to aircraft carriers, this was particularly painful. They had a limit of 81,000 tons, a limit that was already feeling tight simply with the conversions of Akagi and Kaga. So with this in mind, the Japanese continued a trend they had been doing with destroyers and cruisers, trying to skirt the limits of the treaty to get capable ships on limited tonnage, and hulls that were entirely too small. This would result in the creation of the light carrier Ryujo, a ship that left skirting the treaty behind in favor of trying to abuse a loophole, resulting in an interesting ship, one that is often overlooked as a bit of a joke, although for her size, the ship was actually quite capable. Certainly flawed, but not a complete waste of steel. In this video, we'll look at Ryūjō, from her design to her construction and her ultimate fate. In a bit of a break from tradition, we'll begin with the design before covering any of her story. Let's get into it now. This begins, as I mentioned earlier, with the Washington Treaty and its limitations on tonnage. For aircraft carriers specifically, this came out to 135,000 tons for America and Britain, and 81,000 tons for Japan. That tonnage didn't last as long as you might expect. Akagi and Kaga both came out to around 27,000 tons in their initial conversion. That left about 27,000 tons open for new construction. Understandably, the Japanese weren't really fond of building one new carrier, so that meant going for smaller ships to work with the tonnage. This could have taken the shape of smaller fleet carriers, in the roughly 15 to 16,000 ton range. The Japanese would ultimately pursue that option in the form of Soryu and Hiryu. However, the first attempt was to ignore the tonnage limitation in its entirety. There was a loophole in the Washington Treaty. Anything less than 10,000 tons didn't count as an aircraft carrier for the purposes of the tonnage limit. Design and capability didn't come into the question, simply raw tonnage. Now, before I go on, I'll say that sources on the Japanese thought process are pretty limited. The usual go-to for Japanese ships, warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, makes no mention of treaty dodging. Neither does Combined Fleet. Style does make note of it, though, so there's that. Either way, the general story is as follows. With the not a carrier by tonnage loophole in mind, the Japanese designed a new ship. This design came out to 8,000 tons, standard displacement. That left a couple thousand tons to play with before hitting the 10,000 ton limit. It did require quite a few compromises, however. A lightly built hull with basically no armor, and as initially designed, only a single hangar. That would have meant a small air wing, 24 aircraft, and a very low profile. Something coupled with a narrow beam to further reduce tonnage. However, during the construction process, the Japanese Navy decided, no, we actually want a large air group. With the ship already under construction, that meant modification, not a new design from the keel up, which resulted in two things. First, a much taller ship. This is why, especially from the front, Ryujo looks so top-heavy. It also caused severe stability issues with the narrow beam, which was the second issue. Even the fitting of active stabilizers did little to rectify this problem. Still, Ryujo was looking like a successful experiment from a design perspective. The Japanese apparently intended to build more ships just like her. Then the London Naval Treaty intervened. This sealed the loophole. Anything built as an aircraft carrier was an aircraft carrier by the rules of the treaty. No more tonnage dodging. So all that effort resulted in a ship that still counted towards Japan's limit. Not a surprising result in the end. Regardless, let's briefly look at the design detail, then move to service. As launched, Ryujo came out to around 10,000 tons on her normal displacement. This allowed the ship, with her 2 hangars, to carry 48 aircraft. At least in the early 1930s, before the size of aircraft increased. These were carried on a ship with a flush deck, with the bridge mounted just underneath the lip of the forward flight deck. A flight deck that came out to 156 meters, or 513 feet, with a width of 23 meters, or 75 feet. Since it's relevant, the ship's own length was 180 meters, or 590 feet, with a 20-meter, 66-foot beam. Defensive weaponry, meanwhile, consisted of 6 twin 12.7 centimeter, 5-inch gun mounts, 12 barrels in all. These were carried on sponsons along the flight deck, and were supported by 12 twin mounts for 13.2 millimeter machine guns, 24 barrels in all. All of this was pushed through the water by 65,000 shaft horsepower through 2 shafts, for a speed of roughly 29 knots. And with that rounding off the initial design, we can now talk service. This story began on November 26, 1929. Ryujo was laid down by the Mitsubishi Yard in Yokohama. Even with the late change to a double hangar design, this construction went fairly quickly. The ship would be launched on April 2nd of 1931, and then commissioned on May 9th, 1933. It was during the initial construction, however, that the London Naval Treaty was signed, specifically April 22nd of 1930. This rendered Ryujo's initial purpose moot, but the ship was too far along in construction to outright scrap. So even though she now counted towards Japan's tonnage, the Japanese finished the ship. She entered into service with the Japanese fleet. Except this service was short-lived. Not long after the ship joined the fleet, the Tomozuru incident struck in 1934. This involved a torpedo boat capsizing during a typhoon, which was judged to be a result of an overloaded and top-heavy warship. This prompted the Japanese to take a hard look at their fleet, particularly Ryujo, a ship already seen as pretty unstable. As a result, the carrier went in for modification. Her funnels were relocated and curved, with the flight deck widened, while 2 of the 12.7 centimeter mounts were removed. The Japanese also strengthened the keel and added bulges. Unfortunately, even all these changes didn't do enough good. Ryujo returned to service on August 20th, 1934, now displacing around 10,600 tons at her standard displacement. Testing showed the ship to be more stable, but she still had major issues with a wet bow, something that came back to bite Ryujo in the second peacetime incident for the Japanese fleet, the Fourth Fleet incident on September 25th, 1935. This saw another typhoon, which the namesake fleet sailed into. Several ships suffered damage during this, some of it quite severe. Ryujo was one of them. The bridge, flight deck, and superstructure all suffered damage. The bridge, in particular, was dished in by high waves. In addition, the hangar was flooded. The unfortunate Ryujo had to go in for another set of modifications. On October 11th, 1935, the ship began a major overhaul. Over 7 months, the carrier was rebuilt. The forecastle was raised up by a deck to try and deal with the wetness issue, in addition to added flare on the bow for the same reason. The bridge and front flight deck were also rounded out. This did, however, shorten the flight deck from 156 meters, 513 feet, to 154 meters, or 505 feet. While not directly related to the typhoon damage, the ship also received stronger arrestor gear at the same time. All this work kept Ryūjō in dock until May 31st of 1936. She left dock on that day and entered into a new set of sea trials. These would run in turn from June through August of 1936. These were successful and showed a noted improvement in sea keeping. Ryūjō would never be the most stable ship out there, but the modifications had mostly done their job. With her new design in tow, the ship began test work, specifically in testing dive bombers and dive bomber doctrine. This would occupy Ryūjō until late October. On October 29th, the result of these tests came through, namely that the Japanese really liked their dive bombers. They specialized Ryūjō as a dive bomber carrier, transferring her torpedo planes to other carriers. An interesting choice, but considering her limited size, not a bad one. Regardless, these new aircraft would soon be put to use. After some quiet training duty, Ryūjō sailed for China in August 1937. By this point, the Chinese and Japanese were at war, and Ryūjō anchored off Shanghai on August 13th to support Japanese operations ashore. In this, she joined Kaga and Hosho as the 1st Carrier Division. These ships would serve off the Chinese coast from September through early November. From all indications, this went well for the Japanese, although exact details on aerial victories are, as could be expected, difficult to verify, between over-reporting and lack of concrete information. In any case, Ryūjō returned home, where she was temporarily assigned as a training carrier for December of 1937. This proved short-lived, as with the new year came a new assignment. Ryūjō joined Carrier Division 2 with the newly commissioned Soryu, just in time to return to China in March of 1938. Ryūjō would operate in support of Japanese operations through to April, and then she would do the same in October as well. With the success of Japanese operations in the area, Ryūjō would return to Japan by the end of the year. 1939, for its part, was uneventful, ending with a short refit in December that ended by January of 1940, at which point Ryūjō was made a full-time training carrier. She served in that role throughout 1940, only returning to full service on November 15th, specifically as part of the 3rd Carrier Division. By this point, that means she served with the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Division at various points. Interestingly, Ryūjō's air wing had a major change. Remember how the Japanese specialized her for dive bombing? Well, they reversed course. Ryūjō embarked 18 B-5N torpedo bombers and 16 A-5M fighters. There were 2 major reasons for this. First, the Kate was a very versatile aircraft, capable as both a torpedo and level bomber. Secondly, the aft elevator on Ryūjō was showing its age and the compromise in its design. It was too small for more modern and larger aircraft. With the increasing specialization of dive bombers, it was decided to stick with Kates as the offensive punch. More versatile and easier to operate. All of that said, it would be some time before those were put to use. The remainder of 1940 and most of 1941 was still spent on training, even after Ryūjō transferred to the new 4th Carrier Division in April 1941. In fact, she only returned to combat service on December 8th of 1941. December 7th, on the other side of the international date line. Ryūjō was assigned to the invasion of the Philippines, while the Kido Butai struck Pearl Harbor. This saw the small carrier attack Davao in the Philippines on December 8th. 13 B-5Ns, escorted by 9 A-5Ms, struck the area. The fighters strafed and destroyed a pair of PBY Catalinas, but the bombers missed the converted seaplane tender destroyer USS William B. Preston. A follow-up raid, however, did bomb the fuel tank farms. She would remain in the area through December, although her aircraft faced little opposition. Much of the aircraft in the Philippines had been destroyed in the opening moves of the war. Because of this, with the coming of 1942, Ryūjō moved on. She joined the General's southern thrust, moving down to Malaya and the East Indies. This would see the ship engage shipping off Singapore on February 13, 1942. Ryūjō's aircraft would sink or damage several ships during this action, and then repel a British counterattack the following day. All the while, her own bombers continued to strike enemy shipping. So far, she was quite successful. Attempts to strike Allied warships on February 15th went less well. No notable damage was done. However, another attack on February 17th went better for the Japanese. The Dutch destroyer Von Ness was sunk by Ryūjō's aircraft. The carrier would remain in the East Indies until March 5th, during which her aircraft attacked the sinking USS Pope on March 1st. They didn't hit the ship, but they did land several near misses. With the conclusion of the East Indies operations, Ryūjō shifted to the Indian Ocean. Her aircraft supported operations in Burma before she joined up with the Indian Ocean raid on April 1st. Ryūjō's role was largely successful in this, although exact details are hard to sort out. It is noted that her aircraft focused mostly on land attack. In any event, with the Indian Ocean raid concluded, Ryūjō returned to Singapore by April 11th. She would then spend more time on training before a short refit in Japan on April 28th. This seemed to focus mostly on improving her anti-aircraft battery, replacing the machine guns with 25mm cannon. When that was done, Ryūjō exchanged her A5Ms for new Mitsubishi Zeros, and she joined up with the newly converted Junyo as the core of the Aleutian's operation. This was a northern thrust to distract the United States during the Battle of Midway. Ryūjō and Junyo would depart Japan on May 26, 1942, and they would sail north to escort Japanese landing forces and strike American forces at Dutch Harbor, Alaska. Those airstrikes came in 3 waves from June 3rd to June 4th, 1942, although only the first and third waves were successful. Those damaged land installations at Dutch Harbor, but found no shipping. Destroyers were spotted by the first wave, but foul weather allowed them to escape the second wave. Incidentally, one of Ryūjō's fancy new Zeros was piloted by one Tadayoshi Koga, and would crash land on Akutan, where it later became an intelligence coup for the Americans. That aside, Ryūjō departed the area by the end of June. She was back in Japan on June 22nd, 1942, before then returning to the Aleutians to escort a reinforcement convoy on June 28th. This passed without major incident, and Ryūjō returned to Japan on July 13th. This would, as it turned out, be her last time there, because the Guadalcanal campaign kicked off on August 7th. Ryūjō was dispatched to counter this invasion on August 16, 1942. She was now back in the 1st Carrier Division with the 2 surviving fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku. These ships sailed first to Truk, then on to the Solomons, with Ryūjō sent ahead on August 24, 1942. This would prove to be her doom. The carrier launched 2 attacks on Henderson Field as the opening moves of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Those did minimal damage. The same couldn't be said for the American counterattack, which located Ryūjō around 2 p.m. on August 24th. 30 SBD Dauntlesses and 8 TBF Avengers from USS Saratoga descended on Ryūjō. 3 or 4 bombs, sources differ, hit the carrier. These were 1,000-pound weapons, which would probably be more than enough on their own. However, a torpedo also hit Ryūjō, or alternatively 2 torpedoes. Again, it's not entirely clear. Either way, those hits doomed the carrier. She began to list to starboard and lose speed. Within a couple hours, Ryūjō had capsized and sunk. 7 officers and 113 sailors went down with the ship. Ryūjō's story ends here. And yes, she wasn't the best design out there, but the ship gave reliable service, and in the end, that's better than a lot of other ships. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.